Hello, I'm Andrew Richardson. I'm the Office of Vocation Minister for the United Church of Canada in the Atlantic area. And I'm here with three friends, and we are going to be talking today about anti-Judaism in the scripture readings for Holy Week, in particular Good Friday. And this conversation comes about just as part of a larger conversation that we've been having over the last few about what we could do pastorally to help preachers think about the anti-Judaism in these texts. And so I'm joined today by Rev David Atwood, who is the minister at York Cove Head Pastoral Charge in Prince Edward Island, Dr. David MacLachlan, who is a New Testament professor at Atlantic School of Theology, and Rabbi David Ellis, who is Rabbi at Large in the Halifax area. So welcome to all of you, and we look forward to hearing your conversation and comments on this topic. Christians around the world gather for worship during Holy Week. They will hear the familiar story of the betrayal and trial and crucifixion of Jesus. On Good Friday, the Revised Common Lectionary calls for a long passage from the Gospel of John, that writer's depiction of the events of Jesus' last days on earth. In most churches, these words will be read without commentary, and those in the pews will hear John describe how the Jews arrest, put on trial, hand Jesus over to Roman authorities to be crucified, and shout wildly for his death. It is near impossible to hear these words read without concluding that the Jews are the villains in the story and are responsible for the death of Jesus. And so in this way, each Good Friday, the church participates in an unintentional act of anti-Judaism, blaming the Jews for the death of the Messiah. Now, with knowledgeable instructors, Bible study group members can study John's gospel without learning or promoting anti-Jewish attitudes or theological opinions. They may even unlearn prejudicial attitudes they picked up earlier. However, worship is different from study groups, and the liturgical use of some parts of John's gospel cannot always make clear the original context in which John wrote his gospel. Because of the anti-Semitism already present in our culture, and in some prior Christian teaching and preaching, and unfortunately present in some preaching that occurs today, the liturgical use of the Passion narrative in John's Gospel functions to promote and maintain anti-Jewishness, at least for some years. The promotion and maintenance of anti-Jewishness is a serious error we should not want to commit, and which is our responsibility as worship leaders to actively take steps to avoid, corporately as parishes and as a church, and individually as preachers and worship planners and leaders. As New Testament scholar Raymond Brown says, Christian believers must wrestle with the limitations imposed on scriptures, and they must be brought to see that some attitudes found in the scriptures, however explicable in the times in which they originated, may be wrong attitudes if repeated today. We can begin by acknowledging that this text, and the whole Gospel of John in particular, have been the cause of violence against Jews for centuries. The Protestant New Testament scholar Eldon J. Epp advanced the thesis that the attitude toward the Jews that finds expression in the Gospel of John co-acted with the extraordinary popularity of that gospel, so as to encourage and to buttress anti-Semitic sentiments among Christians from the 2nd century CE until the present time. This leads to the conclusion that the fourth gospel, more than any other book in the canonical body of Christian writings, is responsible for the frequent anti-Semitic expressions by Christians during the past 18 or 19 centuries, and particularly for the unfortunate and still existent characterization of the Jewish people by some Christians as Christ killers. The golden-tongued preacher of the 4th century, John Chrysostom, the Archbishop of Constantinople, preached these words to his congregation: "The Jews are the most worthless of all men. They are lecherous, rapacious, greedy. They are perfidious murderers of Christ. They worship the devil. Their religion is sickness. The Jews are the odious assassins of Christ, and for killing God, there is no expiation possible, no indulgence or pardon. Christians may never cease vengeance, and the Jews must live in servitude forever. Tragically, the Christian Holy Friday has often become a time of holy terror for Jews. Throughout the centuries, the remembrance of Jesus' suffering and death served as an excuse for Christians to inflict that same suffering and death on Jews. A Jewish man recalls from his 1950s boyhood that he never went outside on Good Friday to avoid being beaten up by neighborhood boys because the Jews killed Jesus. Such beliefs are still prevalent. Recently, an acquaintance asserted, "Of course Jesus killed Jesus. The Bible says so." And even our own hymnody reinforces this view. A suggested hymn for Holy Week in the United Church Hymn Book, "My Song is Love Unknown" by Samuel Crossman, has verses that read, "Sometimes they strew his way and his sweet praises sing, then crucify is all their breath, and for his death they thirst and cry." In this stanza, the Jews are blamed for not recognizing him as the Messiah, and then within a few days thirsting for his death, for being Christ killers. Christian teaching, once started in this direction, never stopped. Utterly convinced of its right, it has repeated and spread these mythical arguments tirelessly, with methodical thoroughness, through all the powerful means that were and still are at its disposal. And the result is that the myth of Jews as Christ killers has eventually taken on the shape and consistency of facts that have become incontestable. They have ended up being accepted as though they were authentic history, and they become an integral part of Christian thinking. Despite the fact of John's contributing to anti-Semitism, this is not to say that such is the sole or even primary cause of anti-Semitism. It is to say, however, that unwitting or otherwise, anti-Semitic attitudes have either emerged from readings of John or have resulted in the employment of John to support anti-Semitic agendas. It is a troubling fact, for instance, that Martin Luther's characterization of the Jews as villains of the faith contributed to German anti-Jewish sentiments and preaching, which later played roles in the tragic unfolding of the Holocaust. And Luther, of course, is not alone in that matter. Samuel Sandmel reminds us of the anecdote he heard as a child. A man was beating up on Jewish people after attending a Christian worship service. And when a policeman stopped him and asked him why he was doing so, he replied, "Because the Jews killed Christ." And the policeman said, "But that was 2,000 years ago." To which the man responded, "Well, that may be so, but I just heard about it today." The story points to problems of contemporary influence, regardless of what a biblical text originally meant and what it authentically means hence. It is what people make of a text and what people do in response to their understanding of it that present real problems, not just imaginary ones. So what are we to do then when Good Friday comes along and the liturgical expectation is to read the John version of the Passion story? In her influential book, Faith and Fratricide, Rosemary Ruther proposes a radical response. Concluding the section describing the anti-Semitic nature of John's gospel, she says, John gives the ultimate theological form to that diabolizing of the Jews, which is the root of anti-Semitism in the Christian tradition. And there's no way to rid Christianity of its anti-Judaism, which constantly takes social expression in anti-Semitism without grappling finally with its Christological hermeneutic itself. Well, changing our whole Christology seems quite ambitious for the average Christian congregation. And so there perhaps are more realistic options. In today's language, press delete. This is a bit problematic because when we erase an offending text, we erase the harm that these texts have done. And with it, we hide the problem of Christian anti-Judaism. Another response would be to retranslate, to change the Jews to Judeans or Jewish leaders, for example. Again, the problem is masked, and Jesus is further distanced from his own Jewishness. Another would be to historicize, to put the text in its original context. This is an attractive solution because it explains the polemic of John, the gospel writer, and tries to make sense of why he would use such harsh language against the Jews. But the problem here is that we cannot, in all situations where the text is heard or read, give proper historical context. And in the end, the text still comes across as anti-Jewish. But finally, a more useful solution would simply admit the problem. John's gospel is anti-Jewish. And every time the text is read, acknowledge it that the way it has been heard and used to promote hatred and violence toward Jews. Take the time to indicate that thinking of Jews as Christ killers is incompatible with the message of Jesus himself. Ultimately, I think we choose how to read and hear a text. And after 2,000 years of enmity, Jews and Christians today can recover and even celebrate our common past. We can locate Jesus and his earliest followers within rather than over and against Judaism. And we can live into the time when, as both synagogue and church proclaim, we can love God and our neighbor. And I look forward to hearing my friends offer some reflection on this text. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I'm David MacLachlan, and I'm pleased to be part of this conversation. I would like to contribute to it by drawing our attention to the text itself, at least for Good Friday, John 18 and 19. It's a long text. I'm not sure how many people will stay awake through the whole thing, but it's a text that's often read, and many times at high liturgical points in the Christian year, the Gospel of John is read. And sometimes I think Christians have the sense that this is the only way that the story of Jesus is told. We want to see some of the strengths, but also some of the issues that come out of John's rendition here of this, let's say, the last days of Jesus, his arrest, his trial, his death. One thing that scholars note, and I want to focus a little bit on what scholars do when they look at this text and some of the issues that come out of it. Overall, what I'd like us to accomplish here from my end is that people give more thought to what they hear in the church and what they read. And scholars have done a lot of work on issues in John's Gospel and in this text. And really, we should stop and think sometimes about the assumptions that we bring and that we take from a text like this. And if I can accomplish that a little bit, and you can work on that, then I think we'll begin to see differently the issue of Jesus and the church's relationship to the Jewish people. One thing when we start to read this text and when scholars read it, one thing that leaps out to them, although it may not leap out to people in the pews, and that is that John is not alone in bringing polemic into the story of Jesus. Now, in John's Gospel, the polemic against and with the, let's say, the Jews is very strong. It's one of the strongest of the four Gospels. In fact, Matthew is the only Gospel that comes close to John in this kind of polemic with the Jews. Now, one of the problems is in John's Gospel, and it shows up here a little bit, but you need to know that when you get to chapters 18 and 19, we've already heard a great deal about the Jews. Scholars begin to ask, who does John mean by the Jews? This could affect, of course, what we hear at each text, but by the time we're finished reading John's Gospel, we're used to hearing about the Jews without any differentiation. And that, I think, when we do that to any group, but particularly to the Jews and their relationship to us as Christians, then we really put them in a position where somehow they're not seen as individuals. They're not seen as religious people, having theology, keeping the law, whatever is important to them. But we just see them as a group and we lump them all together. Scholars do not satisfy themselves with that. They recognize that John uses this title, but now they ask the question, what does it mean? And in this text, we have a very problematic passage because when Pilate takes Jesus to the crowd, they all respond like one with one voice, and they say, well, we don't want this guy to live. We want him out of here. He should be crucified. And then we tend to put all that shouting and controversy together with the Jews again, but we don't know exactly who was in the crowd, if that's a historical situation. Were they Jews coming to Jerusalem for the festival? Were they Jews who were dissatisfied with Jesus? In chapter 6 of John, Jesus alienates almost all of his disciples by making a statement about eating his flesh and drinking his blood and so forth, and then later explains it after most of his disciples have left and only the 12 are left. And he says, well, I'm talking spiritual things. Well, couldn't you have said that a bit earlier? You might have saved a whole congregation. Well, that in a sense is John's world in John's gospel. There's polemic, and there's irony, and sometimes sarcasm, and sometimes testing of those who follow Jesus. And in this case, I think it is, because Jesus says, well, then are you going to leave, you 12? And perhaps with the women. And they say, well, we don't know where else to go, because we're convinced that you're the one who has the words of truth. So here we are. But we recognize that indeed the gospel itself has a bias built into it. And I think Ruther raises a very difficult issue for any Christian to look at their scriptures and say, the problem is, or maybe in us, but it's also in the text. It's not unusual to see that. If you turn to Matthew's gospel, you'll see a very strong polemic with the Pharisees, between Jesus and the Pharisees. He argues with them almost at every opportunity. There's no peace, there's no living together, there's no working things out. It's really a hostile environment. And John is the only gospel that can really rival that. So we have to recognize that within our own scriptures, and certainly within the four gospels, that this polemic is well and alive. Now, scholars will ask, of course, yes, the perspective we see, but what is the context in which this happens? And what is the context, for example, of Matthew, but particularly for us of John? What was his community facing? What was the relationship to the Jewish people or to the synagogue in his time? Now, those are easy questions to ask, but they're not easy to answer. We cannot figure out quickly what was the setting that John was addressing. But one thing we have to recognize is, of course, within Jewish or other religious, and certainly I think once in a while in the church, it is usual to have controversy, to have difficulties, to have disagreements with one another. It's quite another, however, to use that against another group, or to say that we are always in the right and the others are always in the wrong. And yet we have to admit that John's language and his use of metaphors and the way he speaks about Jesus and the way he has Jesus speak often perpetuates this kind of thinking that it's us and them at every single point. So there are similarities and there are differences between John and the other Gospels, and we have to keep that in mind. And I don't feel apologetic in pointing that out because it lives in the text. This is Matthew's presentation. This is John's. But we can recognize where questions can be posed. And I think they are not just questions to John, but they're also questions to us. We can say to ourselves, do we assume that the crowd was all Jews who were of one kind or one mind or one conviction? Then that's a question that we need to raise. I think it will help us get some distance from being led by the text into thinking this or that. Now, historical considerations are important. Jewish people, Jewish leaders show up in this text, Annas and Caiaphas. We don't have the full council here, but perhaps the reader is to understand that Caiaphas in a way represents the whole council when he speaks with Jesus and when he hands Jesus over to Pilate. But at the same time, it's not the whole group, and we have to recognize that. Today, we make distinctions between us and our political leaders. If they do something we don't agree with, then we're quick to point out, that wasn't me, that was the leaders in Ottawa or Halifax or wherever. But here, sometimes Christians forget that sometimes there are differences within the same community, and that can come to the surface. One of the questions that scholars can also ask is, well, how do we know all these conversations that went on, for example? It's very interesting to try to follow that. Who was there to hear the conversation between Annas and Caiaphas and Jesus, or Pilate and Jesus? And we can say, well, I suppose Jesus told them at some point. Well, it's hard to imagine that. You say Peter is present here. Yes, Peter is present. He's the one disciple who denies Christ 3 times, and we kind of overlook that. He has a problem in identifying himself with Jesus, and yet he distances himself. Pilate, in contrast, in this story of John's rendition, is the one who says he's innocent. He's in contrast to Peter himself, one of the high disciples of Jesus following. We should keep these distinctions in mind because the text doesn't always want to answer questions that we may pose. Then there's also this other disciple who shows up. It's interesting, Peter get in to hear any conversations at all when he was part of the original group that should have been arrested perhaps with Jesus if they had charges against them. But then we find out that this other disciple was known to Caiaphas. And so he was allowed in the kind of inner sanctums or inner regions of the temple, or where Jesus is going to be questioned. And so therefore he lets Peter in, which is interesting. Some of these particulars are interesting to note because the historical question is very real. How do we know this? The Jesus Seminar, for example, and it's the 5 Gospels, it says simply, all these conversations and reportages are really the concoction or the reporting of the Gospel writer. This is not historical writing that we have here as such, although obviously no one's really questioning that Jesus died, or that he perhaps was died or crucified on a Friday and so forth. But a lot of the details are added by the gospel writers, and we have to recognize that and make room for it. Because if we build on some of the aspects that we think we hear in the Gospels, we maybe have to recognize that perhaps, Matthew includes this dream of Pilate's wife, and she sends him a message that don't have anything to do with this man. It's not in John. The portrait of Jesus in John is different. It's almost heroic. When the text starts in chapter 18, they come to arrest him, and he stands up simply and says, "Who are you looking for?" "Jesus of Nazareth." "Well, here I am." And they all hit the ground as though somehow he's going to call down fire from heaven and beat them right there. Well, that's an interesting portrayal of this, but we have to recognize that this theological conviction is very real in our Gospels, and it does lead us in the story as it is told. We may have to step back at times and wonder, okay, is that a possibility or not? Another interesting recognition, of course, is that when Jesus says that to the soldiers who come to arrest him, the comment is also made that Jesus knows all this. He knows this is all going to unfold according to John's Gospel, and he goes to the cross. I think in a way that poses a very deep theological problem for Christians, because what the Gospel writer is telling us is that, well, I don't want to put words in his mouth either, but this is God's will that Jesus should die for whatever reason. Early on in the Gospel, in chapter 1, John the Baptist says, "See Jesus coming there, this guy, he is the Lamb of God who will take away the sins of the world." Well, that's in temple Jewish theological terms at that point. What does that mean? We only know it because there's a very deep connection between the Christian community and the Jewish community. The Christian community has borrowed scriptures. It's used to identify pieces of the story. Why did they divide his garments? Well, because one of the Psalms mentions that. Why was Judas paid so much for whatever? Why? Because Zechariah mentions that. I mean, the interpretation of these events is just as strong and present in the text itself as anything that might appropriate or approximate historical reminiscence. And so we have to make room for that. Now, I know I'm suggesting that, well, maybe we might have some doubts about what's going on and what is being said here and read. Well, I think for thinking Christians and for people who take some time to reflect not only on what is happening in our own text, but what it engenders in us, really, to look upon other people or look down upon them or to blame them for this or for that. No, we have a lot of understanding for Peter's mistakes, but we have very little understanding for Judas's mistakes. And yet Jesus on the cross confesses, it is accomplished. Well, what was accomplished? Was all of this a kind of charade? Are you doing this for fun? It's very hard to imagine that somebody would want to be crucified for some higher purpose. And yet, that is what John's Gospel and this story in 18 and 19 is suggesting to us, that indeed, even the location of the cross has symbolic meaning. It's outside the city. It's not in Jerusalem. It's outside. And some of the leaders of the Jews simply say, well, don't put that title, Pilate, on the cross, because then everybody will see it. Now, Pilate doesn't much care. He says, what I've written that's what I've written. Even the portrayal of Pilate is an interesting thing. Was he really being led by the crowd? As what we know about him in other historical sources is that he was not going to be pushed around at all. He was a pretty ruthless character. Why would it bother him that an innocent person should go to the cross? He is the one who takes responsibility for this. Caiaphas, earlier in John's Gospel, says it's better for one person to die than the whole nation. Maybe the concern about the Romans coming in and saying, this is rebellion, and I don't care who started it, but we have to do something about it. And Caiaphas may speak on behalf of the Jewish people to say, or the rulers, hey, we have to be careful about what kind of impression we give to Rome. They're the ones who have the power here, and they're the ones in Pilate who takes responsibility for the crucifixion. It doesn't matter, in a sense. He gives permission. He's the one who says, okay, I know he's innocent. We don't know whether he really said that or not, but at the same time, he just simply backs away and allows it to happen. And that is as much responsibility, if we want to nail somebody with responsibility in this issue, as we can think about. I think what my concern here is that when we hear these stories read, that we do give some deeper thought to what may be said and how this may happen. We know John has wonderful texts. It talks about, very high theology and very important things to the church, and leads almost right up to the doorstep of the main creeds of the church and so forth, and the confessions of faith. But at the same time, we have to be daring and courageous to say, but maybe some of these things have led us along paths that we should not have taken, and certainly today we cannot take, by equating the Jewish people that we know and the synagogue that we know to what we think happened in the first century. So, I'm just trying to name some things here in the text that I hope people will think about, that you'll give some thought to. Not because I'm trying to say that the text has nothing to say to us, but I think, as Andrew suggested, if this is the same Jesus who said, love one another as I have loved you, think of chapter 13, which is a very high theology of love and care for one another. We should also be able to show that to other people, regardless of what our differences may be, and how we think that should work out. Indeed, we're living in times now when forgiveness and understanding towards one another is of a high premium. We should be looking for that in the text and hoping that it will come through. I'll leave it there for now, and I understand too that we'll have an opportunity to have conversation again and questions at some point. So that's my reflections, in a sense, from the Scholar's Corner, and I hope it's some help to you as you listen to John, but particularly the text for Good Friday.
Hi, my name is Reverend David Atwood, and I'm happy to be part of this conversation about the text that we use in our worship and in our liturgy. In looking at the problems that arise from anti-Jewish texts in the New Testament, particularly in the Easter readings from the Gospel of John, my perspective is as a congregational minister. And I've also had the privilege of exploring biblical texts as part of an interfaith group of Christians and Jews studying the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament. There are some reflections from that experience which come to mind. relating to the supersessionism or replacement theology, which has been part of Christianity for most of its history. Secondly, the different ways in which Jews and Christians tend to approach and interpret the scriptures. And thirdly, our understanding of who Jesus is as the Christ, and how we tend to disconnect this from who he was as a Torah-observant Jew. The reality is that churchgoers often tend to see the New Testament as being superior to the Hebrew Bible, and there's an inherent thinking among Christians that the Hebrew Bible is somehow displaced by the New Testament, and that the God of the Hebrew Bible is one of judgment, whereas the God of the New Testament is one of grace. In other words, that the Hebrew Bible supports the New Testament, but is not equal to it. The way in which we as Christians interpret biblical verses is also different. We tend to see the scriptures as an end product, closed, not open to question or to disagreement. While a hermeneutic of suspicion, where texts are read with skepticism to expose deeper or hidden truths, might exist in part, this is not generally the case at a congregational level. By comparison, in Judaism, it is more likely that biblical texts will be treated as an open conversation rather than a closed conclusion. For example, a midrash from Megillah 10 on the story from the Torah of the crossing of the Red Sea states, "The Egyptians were drowning in the sea. The angels wanted to sing before God, and the Lord God said to them, 'My creations are drowning, and you are singing before me?'" Well, this is a text that deliberately challenges how the story in the Torah is commonly read. So there's a rich tradition in Judaism which is comfortable questioning and pushing back against the text, a tradition which does not typically occur within Christianity. When we look at the text in the Gospel, particularly in John, they reflect the tensions that existed between early Christian communities in the synagogue, and clearly in many respects they are anti-Jewish, even though congregations today may not consciously interpret them as such. Despite arguments that the disparaging use of the word Jew in Greek Iudaioi in this gospel refers either to temple authorities or to people from Judea who might have disagreed theologically with Jesus and the Galileans, the reality is that the author of John is reflecting the history of a separation of church and synagogue and all the tensions that created. And consequently is morphed together categories of Jews which tend to be described in the earlier Gospels as Sadducees, scribes, and Pharisees into one common class, the Jews, who are understood by the author to have been in opposition to Jesus and his message. Well, the question is, how do we deal with these texts, particularly during Easter, when they are so prominent? One approach is to remove the offensive text from public readings of Scripture. But I would suggest that's not a good practice, in part because it continues a problematic tradition which already exists through the lectionary. Now, the lectionary, while a very important resource in the weekly preaching cycle, it contributes towards the dilemma because it leaves out vast sections of texts in the Hebrew Bible because they do not support or bring light to the New Testament. The Hebrew Bible, through the lectionary, tends to be used as a pointer to the full revelation of God contained in the New Testament. And this contributes to the ongoing caricature of Judaism as a faith that has been superseded by Christianity. Maybe what is needed in preaching and in worship is a midrash type approach, one that does not excise the anti-Jewish texts in the New Testament but challenges them in other ways, like the verses from Megillah 10 do in the story of the crossing of the Red Sea. As an example, though the Gospel of John disparages Jews, Christians readily accept that Jesus was a Jew, but the word "was" implies two things. One, that in history Jesus was a Jew, but the word "was" in its past tense suggests that Jesus' Jewish identity is not a continuity in terms of who he is as the Christ. His Jewishness and the community of which he was a part is jettisoned in Christian theology. A midrash approach, grounded in our belief in the resurrection, would proclaim that Jesus lived as a Jew, died as a Jew, and resurrected as a Jew. Challenges to establish belief frequently exist in the world of arts and literature. In James Joyce's book Ulysses, there's a scene in a Dublin pub where Bloom, the hero, and a Jew, is being denigrated by his nationalist Christian neighbors. But Bloom challenges them, and he retorts, Mendelssohn was a Jew, and Karl Marx, and Mercadante, and Spinoza, and the Savior was a Jew, and his father was a Jew. Your God was a Jew. Christ was a Jew like me. In worship, a midrash approach to these texts might be to do as Bloom does, offer an argument to counterbalance them. It could be achieved in other areas of the worship liturgy where we let the problematic text stand, but through other parts of the liturgy we confess that the sacrificial love of the cross has cast a dark shadow of discrimination against the very people who Jesus as a Jew identifies with. Though creeds are seen to be authoritative formulas of belief that sustain and undergird our faith, we could give ourselves permission to make midrashic modifications to them at times, to affirm Jesus' Jewishness. For example, in our United Church Creed, we believe in God who has come in Jesus, the one who lived, died, and resurrected as a Jew, the Word made flesh, to reconcile and make new, who works in us and all people of faith by the Spirit. As Christians and as Gentiles, though our history has been one of exclusion and discrimination against Jews, it is through Jesus, the Jew, that we have been included as alien and strangers into that original Abrahamic covenant between God and Israel. As Paul the Apostle writes, we are a wild olive shoot, grafted in among the others, and now sharing in the nourishing root of the olive tree. So we should not be arrogant towards the branches, and if we are, just remember, it is not we who support the root, but the root that supports us. Thank you.
This is Rabbi David Ellis. I'm privileged to be part of this discussion about the issues of Holy Week. I am the one who raised this issue to my Christian colleagues because there's a lot of buzz in the Jewish media all the time about anti-Semitism. Some of it is kind of just playing things over and over again, hollering wolf. I think that some of it is actually very real, and you have to keep an eye out for it, and you have to sort out between the various voices and aspects of that. But it's quite clear that during Holy Week, there are some readings, not now, but in the past, have been used by various churches to, the verses can be read as being, now you have to define your terms, anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic, whatever it's going to be. Anti-Semitic is not a good word to use, I don't think. Anti-Semitic, I think, should be used only to the type of hatred of Jews that took place in the 19th century, where Jews became Semites, kind of a race in that. I don't think the hatred of Jews throughout the ages was that. I think it was based on religious grounds. That maybe there was some element of the tribal aspect to it in that then, but that was different. But anyway, you can find definite texts in the New Testament that are anti-Jewish, in opposition to the Jewish religion. And in those days, people didn't often sit down and have tolerant discussions or see each other's point of view about things. They often girded themselves to defend against enemies, present their own points of view for that. And so that's how things were read in those days. Now, they don't have to be read that way in our day. That's what this whole thing is about, being able to discuss this. The major churches have gone a long way with this in the last number of years. The Roman Catholic Church has corrected some of its liturgy. All the Protestant, the mainline Protestant churches are quite well aware of this issue. It's discussed in theology schools by ordained ministers. What my concern is that these discussions go out to the wider public. If they don't know about it, they know what the issue is. And I want to remind people to understand what this is about also. They understand it fully. They to their Christian neighbors and others, kind of pass by socially and have discussions with them. But I'm not sure my group will fully understand this either. So this is a whole thing to be able to have this. Like I say, I don't accuse Christians of doing this anymore, but I'll tell you a story. I had it one time. I was talking to a woman in Texas, where I used to live, a Holocaust survivor. And she told me the story that I had visited, I gave a presentation at a Christian church or something, just before Easter and Passover. And she was so upset about what I had done because she was from Poland. She said, you know what they also do in Poland? Whenever they wanted to start an attack on the Jewish community, they used to ring the church bells. And that was the sign to go out to kill all the Jews in the community. So he was so upset about me that I didn't even go into it. And a friend of hers saved me, though. There was another man from Poland. She says, well, Sarah, let me tell you something. It's not like it was in the old world. I've gone to churches. I've talked to them. The churches people here are not like they were in the old world. So it has happened. Thank God it is rare to happen in North America and civilized society in Western Europe, but it's still an undertone that's there, and people have to be aware of it and that. And I don't want to wave a bloody shirt and accuse people of false things, but just that people are aware of the issue and that we don't try to focus on this so much, but we look toward positive things also. But we do need to be aware of this, to be able to be cognizant of it, be aware, read our texts more carefully, ask questions about it, delve more deeply into them. That's what I hope this will promote. I hope it's not a final sort of thing. I hope it's leading on to other discussion among us Jews and among Christians and other groups also. Thank you very much. Rabbi David Ellis.